Wander in. I'm Janet Gornick. This is Heather Boushey, as you probably figured that out. So I'm going to just take a few moments for some introduction. And I'm actually, let me mention that I'm playing double duty this evening. I'm playing triple duty. I'm introducing us. We're efficient around here. I'm introducing us, and I'm asking questions, and I'm also going to be answering some of them because we're conversing together. So I'm just going to do whatever I feel like. It's really my pleasure to be hosting this program, though, which is brought to you by the Graduate Center Public Programs in partnership with the Luxembourg Income Study Center, one of the research centers here at the Graduate Center. I think most of you probably know, but for some maybe who are new and for the live stream audience, let me just mention where you are. You're at the CUNY Graduate Center. This is the doctoral granting campus of the City University of New York. We have 24 campuses here in New York City, and this is where most of the graduate degrees are granted. The Graduate Center is a school of arts and sciences. It's a center for applied and theoretical research, and very much a platform for performance and conversation and lectures. That's a big part of our engagement here in New York City is public programming. So I've had the great pleasure over the last 3 years of partnering with Karen Sander and Jay Golan and others here in overseeing a number of programs related to inequality. So this one is at least more or less in that area as well. So it's really been a pleasure, and I hope that you will enjoy what we're going to do. So let me tell you a little bit more. I'm going to introduce, as I said, I'm Janet Gornick. I'm professor in political science and sociology here at the Graduate Center, and I'm the director of the Luxembourg Income Study Center. The Luxembourg Income Study, which is now known as LIS, is a cross-national data archive in Luxembourg that enables cross-national research on poverty and inequality, and we have a satellite office here at the Graduate Center. This is Heather Boushey. As I said, you know, Heather's executive director and chief economist at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, and she's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C. She got her PhD here in New York City, yay, from the New School for Social Research and a bachelor's degree from Hampshire College. Before her current position at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, she was at the Joint Economic Committee in Congress, at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and also at the Economic Policy Institute. These are some of the great progressive think tanks in Washington. She was co-author at EPI for their flagship publication, The State of Working America. Heather grew up in a union family in Mukilteo, Washington, and her family roots inform her work, as I think she will tell you. So I want to say just a few more words by way of biography, and I'm going to indulge myself in a biography of Heather that's also an autobiography, and you'll see why I hope in a moment here. Because and I'm saying this because I think I want you to know a little bit about the context of this conversation and the substance. I've known Heather for many years. I think we figured about 20 years when she was a graduate student at the New School. For many of those years, we both worked on what I often call work-family policy. She prefers the term work-life policy. And over those many years, our work shared a lot of commonalities. We've both paid a lot of attention to the same policy areas: paid family leave, the regulation of working time, and child care and other forms of care. We both spent years in Washington, D.C. in the middle of the sausage making, me before graduate school and Heather after school. We both tend to see the world through economic eyes, although she more than I. And our overlapping lives then meant that we probably over many years have been on, I would say, 20 panels together. So I hope we're going to find something to disagree on so we don't bore you all to death. But so we've appeared for many years. Heather's work was on the U.S. and mine has been comparative, again, in the same policy areas. In the last 5 years, we both shifted our work. We're both running research centers focused on income inequality. Those shifts, I think, took place for various reasons. And moving from work-family policy into income inequality took us into new types of data, new intellectual and policy communities, new questions, and a different set of meetings and conferences. And I often note that now, when I go to meetings on income inequality, there's only one person there whom I knew from my prior life in work and family, and that's Heather. It's nice to see her, as I often tell her, but that's not why I'm telling you this. My point is that these two intellectual communities interact far too little. So this large community of research and to some extent activism on work and family, which has really developed a great amount over recent decades, It's a community overwhelmingly full of women, something we'll talk about, I think. And I would say that it has historically paid too little attention to class, although that's changed in recent years. The world of income inequality scholars, where we both find ourselves today, one could make the mirror comment, overwhelmingly male, but I think it's a world and a conversation that has largely missed the importance and the complexity of work-family or work-life conflict, and especially issues related to care. These two communities, these two intellectual worlds should interact, but they don't anywhere enough, and my great hope is that Heather's book is going to change that, because she's bringing these two conversations together, and she's one of the rare scholars who thinks about income inequality inseparably from questions related to work and family. So that's where we are. So I'm really delighted to have her with this wonderful book, which I was going to hold up, but all of a sudden I don't have it. But I think some of you probably do have it, and it's for sale, as you'll see. So here's what we're going to do. We're right on time. From about 7 to 7:55, we're going to talk about the book. I have a number of questions that I'd like to ask Heather. Of course, I'll throw in my own thoughts a little bit here and there, but mostly we want to hear from her and her thinking in relation to the book. Around 7:55, we're going to open up for Q&A from you all, so we want to give you a chance to ask questions, and there are going to be some microphones. Thank you, Karen. I'll hold that up again in a second. And then at 8:15, Heather's going to sign some books, and they're for sale. And the book is called Finding Time, The Economics of Work-Life Conflict. You can see right here, Heather Boushey. And I'm afraid, just to demonstrate in addition the smallness of our world, I was actually asked to review the book for Science. So first of all, it's quite thrilling that this book would be reviewed in Science. For her. Yeah, you're right, for her. Well, I mean, actually, I think for all of us, that Science thinks that this book is worthy of reviewing is really marvelous, and I was very happy to be asked to review it. I did actually say, I know her, do you really want me to review it? So they asked me if I could be objective, and I said that I could, so I reviewed it. So a copy of my review, which will be published next week, the galleys are on the table out there. So it did give me the opportunity to read the book extremely carefully. So there are a few things about the book I didn't like, so we'll see if we can get to those. So. Not really, but a little bit. Okay, so here we are. So Heather, no, we see things a little bit differently, which we'll get to in just a few moments. Okay, so Heather, let me turn after that lengthy opening. What I'd love you to do is take about 3 minutes, if you would, and tell the audience here what the book is about. What are your main claims?
And thank you all for coming, and thank you, Janet. I especially enjoyed the autobiography of your introduction, and I want to start there with the 3 minutes about the book. Because I, like Janet, am thinking a lot about inequality. I'm an economist, and if you think about the biggest economic trends in the United States over the past few decades, it's been this very big income squeeze, this rising inequality and the squeeze on family incomes. And that's one big trend that's happened, but of course it's happened alongside this squeeze on family time. We've seen women moving out of the home and into the labor market alongside this squeeze on incomes, and these two things are interrelated. In many ways, families have coped with the stagnating wages, especially of men, by having women put in more hours of work. I'm not saying necessarily that it's causal. I think there's a lot of reasons that women have moved into the labor market, because it's been especially middle class and upper middle class women who've increased their labor force participation. But what I talk about in the book is that without those added hours and then the added rising earnings of women, families at the bottom of the income distribution would have seen their incomes fall even further than they did between 1979 and today. Families in the middle class would have seen their incomes fall, although they did grow a little bit, about 12% or so. They would have fallen had women not increased their hours and earnings. And professional families would have seen their incomes continue to rise, but not rise the sky-high way that they have. So the added employment of women has really made all the difference in thinking about these inequality trends. But all of this added work has led to this time squeeze for families, and it's happened within a policy context that's made for families that don't look like what families look like today. So I argue in the book that that the bulk of our social policy, I mean, this is not an argument, this is a fact, the bulk of our social policy around time use can all be traced back to the New Deal, the Social Security Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the National Labor Relations Act. These are the key pieces of legislation that still provide the boundaries for the rules that govern time use. And wonderful pieces of legislation. Spearheaded by the first woman cabinet secretary, Secretary Perkins, who was the first person to be a secretary of the Department of Labor, the newly implemented agency, but done in a time when they weren't thinking about care work. They were thinking about overwork, minimum wages. The Social Security Act, of course, is about how do you give people income when they're not going to work again because they're retired or because they've lost a job through no fault of their own, and you're trying to get somebody through this time period. But not thinking about the ways that the fact if you have no one at home today, what kinds of policies do you need? So I talk about this, that those policies presume that there's this silent partner at home that does all the care work, and that workers, can just go about their day presuming that somebody else is going to pack their lunch and do their laundry and take care of the kids. And that's not true anymore, but they're sort of doing this in this policy context that hasn't adapted. So what we need to do is rethink this. I make a lot of arguments in the book that this isn't just about economics or policy, but fundamentally it's about politics. That when we think about the income squeeze, because it's a time pressure and because it affects how we live our daily lives, I see sort of as we're looking at the political climate and people feeling frustrated, they're not just frustrated about not having enough money, they're frustrated about the added hours they have to do, and they're not getting enough money, and that nobody's helping them. There isn't any support for any of that work, and we haven't addressed the lack of this silent partner at home anymore. We haven't come to terms with the fact that the American wife is now actually, in most families, the American worker. So those are the big themes. As an economist, I talk about the economic implications of dealing with these issues, and I look at the policies that we need. I break them down into policies for when we need to be here at home, policies around paid time off, paid sick days, paid family leave, policies when we need to be there at work, but we need to make that work for families, predictable schedules, access to workplace flexibility, continued rules on overwork, mandatory overtime, part-time parity, policies around care, both for children and for elders. I probably talk more in the book about elder care than child care, because I think we know about child care a lot more than we know about elder care. And then I make an argument about fairness, that because we live in this world that isn't made for families as they live and work today, there's a lot of discrimination against people that have care responsibilities. And it's really, we need to also come to terms with that. We have a work world that presumes that you don't have care responsibilities, but most people do. How do we cope with that? And then I argue a lot that there are positive economic implications of dealing with these challenges.
Great. That's a great segue into the first, thank you, Heather, for the first question that I wanted to ask you. You've sort of touched on this already, but one of the things that, for those of you who have had a chance to read the book or even take a look at it quickly, you'll realize that the book is framed around an economic argument, economics ideas. And as Heather notes in the book, a lot of the discussion out in the public world is sort of about other things, about family well-being, about fairness, about social cohesion, kind of asking questions about why are we as a country, for example, not kind of nicer to families. But your argument is really very much an economics argument. And so my question to you, I know you're an economist, but I know that you think in a very interdisciplinary way. Did you write the book as an economics book because that's your natural instinct, or was that a strategic decision to get a policy audience more comfortable? What makes you hopeful that anyone cares about logic, economic or otherwise, in the political world that we live in today?
Well, yes, I could be delusional, but I don't think so. I wrote the book, I came at it from an economic perspective, I mean, primarily because I am an economist, and I've worked a lot with the advocates that have pushed for these policies over the years, and am often the only economist in the room in those circles, and I'm often in all of these economic rooms where nobody's thinking about time, and they're not thinking about care, and they're not thinking about these massive changes that have happened for families up and down the income spectrum. And so I really, I mean, kind of like in your introduction, for me, I felt like it was a mashup of the two different worlds that I have been a part of for so long, that we can't ignore the fact that employers want this unbounded time, and that there are real economic implications all throughout the economic cycle in terms of labor supply and labor demand and profitability and family consumption that are all affected by the lack of dealing with addressing work-life conflict. So I came at it because I think there are these very serious economic implications. But there were a couple of other things that really motivated me. I would say there are three. One is that I was really tired of reading about these issues on the style pages. Now, I love reading the style pages of the magazines, like in the newspaper. It's great, but it's really frustrating to, month after month, see these really important issues around how people are supporting themselves, showing up in that section of the newspaper rather than in the business section. And so I wanted to make this economic argument. Second, another frustration, I don't know if we all write books because we're frustrated about things, but certainly that was the case for me. Another was that a lot of people, when they're talking about the economic implications of dealing with work-life conflict, a lot of people will say, okay, well, we need to make the business case. And when you go out there and when advocates are trying to push for policies, you'll hear policymakers push back or the business community push back that this isn't good for business. And I talk a lot in the book about Christine Quinn. If you will indulge me in a quick story here, because it was a seriously motivating point for the book. In 2010, in New York City, there was this campaign for paid sick days. And the advocates had lined up the majority of the city council, and Christine Quinn was, she said she was a progressive, she was a city council leader, she said that she wanted to be the next mayor, and but she wouldn't bring up paid sick days for a vote. Now, this was a bill, if my memory serves me, it was either 5 or 7 days of paid sick days, allowing workers to earn a few days of paid sick days a year, right? This is not going to destroy capitalism as we know it. But in her statement for why she wouldn't bring it up for a vote, she said, this is a really important, and I'm paraphrasing, I quote it in the book, but it was something like, this is really important, it's nice to have, and I really want to do it, but I just can't because doing so would threaten the viability of small businesses in New York City. And that's an argument about maybe an individual business, but that's not an economic argument. Economists were supposed to take into account what's happening not just inside of one firm that's looking at the immediate cost tomorrow of a policy change, but the whole economy. What is this going to do to families? What's this going to do to consumption? What's this going to do to labor supply, labor demand? If every firm has to do this, then you're leveling the playing field. So the argument, we've for too long been trapped in this very small argument about what's good for the economy that's very narrow. And I feel like these are the perfect issues to say, we haven't been thinking about the economy as economists would. We've been thinking of it in this very small supply side angle, and so I wrote an economics book using the policy issues that I know something about, but in some days it felt more like they were an example of a bigger economic argument rather than the other way around.
Right. Okay. So let me ask you then, talk a little bit about how you decided which policies to focus on. So we know, you begin with sort of what's the problem, what's broken, and it's many things you talked about, time poverty, economic insecurity, stress, inequity, regressive wage structures, and so forth. So you've proposed this institutional fix, which basically includes various forms of paid leave. New York State just passed paid leave, as some of you probably know, the regulation of working time, and of course, care. So talk to us a little bit about why those three and why only those three. And I say that again, and you'll forgive a little autobiography, Heather knows this. So I myself wrote a book many years ago, the same three policy areas, but comparative. And a lot of people said, what? Well, you didn't talk about healthcare, you didn't talk about housing, you didn't talk about actually even the tax system, you didn't talk about transportation. All of these things affect our capacity to balance work and, quote, life. So how did you decide what was in and what was out? Does this reflect your notion of either the real policy priorities or of political feasibility, or are you talking to the next administration? What are you doing there?
Yeah, well, these are all good questions. Yes, I mean, I think that So one thing I will add, so there are three, the policies around paid time off, policies around scheduling, policies around care, and then policies around fairness. So I talk about family responsibilities discrimination. So I will just make sure that we add that one, because I do think it's really important. But each of these is about, it's in some way about time and about dealing with the loss of this silent partner at home. And so that was my entry point. And thinking about what the New Deal gave us in terms of allowing families to both do what we need to do to earn the income we need to support our families and have enough time to provide the care and love and attention, all the good stuff that happens inside families every day. So my entry point was thinking about that intersection right there. And granted, there's a lot of other things, but I do think there is a concise list of policies that are about that time use and about dealing with the fact that there's no longer, in most families up and down the income spectrum, only about a quarter of families with children actually have a full-time stay-at-home caregiver. And that, is, of course, is a remarkable shift, but it's that shift that I'm trying to really address. But on to the political question, I was trying to lay out a policy agenda for policymakers who want to deal with this, and was very hopeful. I tried to get the book out before the start of the 2016 campaign cycle. I think I did okay. It's been available for a few weeks, but because I saw these issues coming down the pike, and I know that we'll get to this, hopefully later on in the questions, but it seemed to me that this bucket, there's a lot of energy around them when we can see the intersection. And so thinking about this as a package, you can't just do one of them. You have to do all four. And so I wanted to make it clear it's not just one. You have to do all four of these together in order to really make a difference. So if you have a policy platform, this is what it needs to be.
Okay, actually, why don't you take a moment or two? I realize I'm sort of presuming that people know what the policy package contains. So leave, of course, enables people to stay home a bit. Child care and other forms of non-family care enable people to leave home. And then, obviously, working time is going to reorganize some of the demands on their time. And I know the fairness piece is there as well. Heather's particularly interested in discrimination against caregivers, as well as against, we know much more about gender. That's I think most of you are probably more familiar with that. So talk a little bit about, though, how this package is going to balance the capacity to stay home when needed, to leave the home when needed. Is it going to be maximizing people's choice? Is it good for, is the policy package designed to help parental employment or child well-being? Or tell them a little bit about the policy package and what it would all look like in place.
So I mean, you've summarized some of it, but to kind of put it into a little bit of context, right? We need, if there's nobody at home, you need to be able to deal in times when somebody's sick, a kid's sick, or your elder parent's sick, or whatever, sick kids, sick people. You need some sort of time, or you have a new child. You need to be able to do all the things that if you had somebody at home they could deal with. So I think one sort of way of thinking about it now is that for some of the need is that, it used to be, of course, the case that if you had a stay-at-home mom, a stay-at-home wife, right, when a married assume a heterosexual married couple and assume a stay-at-home wife, as they aged and as his parents become sick and needed caring, or like the aunt or somebody in his family needs care, then she, because she would have this time, would be able to provide this care. And so the policy package has to deal with not just the children, but anything that silent partner, that person at home, used to have the capacity to do. So one is that you need to be able to give people who actually have jobs a little bit of time off, knowing that they can get their job back, and ideally not losing pay, so that they can stay at home and provide that care. So that's sort of the first bucket. The second, though, is that around hours, what's remarkable, of course, is as we've seen more caregivers go into work, we've also seen the rise of unpredictable schedules. We've seen it be very difficult for workers, especially low-income and middle-class workers, to have any control over their schedules at all. So those workers that have access to workplace flexibility tend to be those at the top. So, but, and I'm sure everyone in this audience and watching has had, that one day where it's like, if you could just make your schedule work a little bit, then everything could fall into place, right? If you could just get off work like an hour early to pick your kid up after work or find some way to adjudicate it, then everything else could work. So giving workers some control over schedules, or at least having a predictable schedule, which is now so important, especially for low-income workers, is the second bucket. And the care issues, which I think are well known, but I think it's important to note that it's about access, but it's about affordability and quality. And there are significant labor supply implications and even labor demand implications for the kinds of quality care we have. So those are the first three buckets. And then the discrimination piece is, somewhat obvious that we shouldn't be discriminating against people who have care responsibilities. And Vermont and San Francisco are two of the places that have been experimenting with family responsibilities discrimination legislation, which is very exciting to see.
Right, exactly. Okay, so what I was hoping, and I think you got a bit of that, is to get a sense of the package and the sort of the theory and the framework that Heather has put together as she thinks about what's the problem that we're trying to solve, or the set of problems. So let me turn your attention, Heather, now to policy and politics a little bit more directly. In the book, you've written a lot about subnational policy development, meaning, of course, policies at the state and city level, which is where most of the activity is taking place, by the way, in most of these policy areas in the U.S. So we've had various forms of essentially maternity pay in 5 states. Now we have some form of paid family or parental leave in about 5 states, and a number of things are happening at the state and city level. So I have been concerned for a very long time. Well, actually, let me back up to say you're quite praising a lot of these local programs, as they deserve, I think, but I've been concerned for a very long time that in the U.S., as advocates and policymakers are building our very rudimentary system of work and family, that we're doing it at the state and local level. I'll digress to say something that most of you probably know. We're way behind the rest of the world in almost all of these policy areas. They're mostly national, and they're really widely established, in particular all through Europe. But here we have almost nothing at the national level. Our laws are simply silent on many of these things, or they're meager, or both. So a lot is happening at the state and local level, and Heather gives a lot of examples. So my question is, can you help me be less worried about this? I worry if we develop things at the state and local level that we'll never get them at the national level, and that will introduce new forms of inequality, because then people often say it's sort of a facetious comment for kids. If you want to have a good life, you want to choose the right parents. So you want to choose the right parents in the right state, also in this country.
San Francisco.
Or the right city, right? Because if you have the right parents in the wrong state in this country, it's worse than the other way around. So there's incredible inequity across the states and cities. Okay, I'm giving a speech here a little bit. But what activists will often say is, if we develop it locally, it will trickle up. Think about the New Deal. But there are other examples, like, for example, temporary disability, which was maternity, where we had 5 states and then 55 years and we didn't get a 6th state. So I worry that it's not spreading laterally, it's not going to trickle up. And so when paid family leave was passed in California and all the advocates were popping champagne corks, I was crying in my office.
Oh no, oh, well, So let me give you some optimism on 2 different kinds of fronts. So first, let me just start up by saying I 100%. I work in D.C., so I think federal policymaking matters, and we're one nation, and we can't be giving people different standards and rights in different parts of the country. I don't think that's sustainable, especially because these things are so important. So I think that we should have federal solutions. One thing that I'm so excited about this book, when I started working on work life, when I kind of was dedicating my intellectual energy to it about full time, was in about 2005, and I was like, I really want to focus on this. And when I started, you had to look abroad for examples of, in every area that I'm looking at, you had to look abroad for good models. By the time I finished the book, every single policy idea that I talk about in this book is in place somewhere in America. And every time I think about it, it sends chills down my spine, because it's an amazing accomplishment. And so one point is that in a time when there is, we have this perception of this horrible political dysfunction, nothing's happening, we haven't been able to do anything for working families, I would like to point out that the bright spot in this, in the political outcomes, is policies around work-life. We have seen enormous accomplishments. And that's really, there's something very powerful there. It's both that it's really compelling to people, it's compelling to politicians, it's compelling to voters, and we've been able to make it, people have been able to make it happen. So that's on the plus side, right? It's demonstrating success. And as an economist, it's super exciting because now there's all these places we can study and we can say, what the economic impacts are and push back on people who say, well, we can't do it because of job killer. And I say, no, actually, this state's done it and this city's done it, and we can show you, you don't have to go to France, you can just go to California, New Jersey, or Wisconsin, all sorts of places for different kinds of policies. So that's one point. I'm glad that you mentioned temporary disability insurance because it is the perfect sort of foil for this, which is that in the 1950s, 5 states, California, New Jersey, Rhode Island, New York, and Hawaii all implemented temporary disability insurance programs that allow individual workers to take up to, in some cases, it depends on the state, the rules are a little bit different, but about a year or so of leave if you have your own illness. And that includes leave for pregnancy, for maternity, and for recovery. Well, it's very exciting because the first new social insurance programs that we've seen in the United States since then have been states that have added on paid family and medical leave for to do baby bonding, to care for a new child, and to care for another family member in a number of states. California, New Jersey, Rhode Island, now New York as of this week, and we haven't seen Hawaii do this yet, but Hawaii's program is different. I don't know that we will see them go in the same way. But I say that because the only states where we've seen paid family medical leave have been the states that had this long-standing program that they could latch onto to create this new system, because creating paid family medical leave is very complicated. It requires a whole structure to identify eligibility and administer benefits. So I think we're actually at the end of the line on, I think, and I know that there's state advocates who I'm sure if they were watching or in the room or would be very frustrated that I would say that, but I think we're at the end of the line in terms of getting states to adopt paid family medical leave, and I think it puts a lot of urgency and pressure on Congress to act. And there's great legislation that's been introduced that would provide 12 weeks of paid family medical leave, just like here in New York State. The legislation is actually very similar at the federal level to what you all just did here, and I think it's putting a lot of pressure there. So I think that we can learn from it. There's a lot of great examples, but I think you're right that there's an endpoint to it, and I think that now is the moment to be really pushing at the federal level to say, you know what, we've learned as much as we can, and now we need to make this happen. Because if we wait a decade or two, then it'll be like TDI and it'll never happen. So there's urgency, which is why I finished the book.
Well, that was, as I said, that's a cheerful take on the TDI story, because that was a long 50 years between the time that nothing happened and then nothing else happened. I think what worries me, though, in all seriousness, with this paid leave, and we're both sort of policy geeks watching this very carefully, my concern is 20 years from now that 15 states will have excellent social insurance funded paid family medical leave. 15 states will have mediocre paid family leave, and 20 states will have nothing, and we know which 20 states those will be.
See, I think that it's so hard to set up a new system, and it's so costly. And Washington State passed paid parental leave back in 2007. They passed it in 2007, and they still have not implemented it because they can't figure out how to pay to set up this new system. I actually think it's very hard. DC's trying to do it, and you look at their legislation, how much it's going to cost, and it's like, oh my goodness, it is ridiculous, I think, to do. It doesn't make sense. It's not a good use of public funds to be setting up these standalone systems. And so I think there will be pressure to do this because now it's shown how politically powerful it is, how potent it is, but also in the favor of the end of the line. There's over 24, maybe more than two. I mean, there's definitely more than 24. I don't know if it's 36 yet. Places that have passed into law paid sick days. Also, New York. Once Quinn didn't become mayor, and you got Bill De Blasio, it was like one of the first things he did was signed into law paid sick days. All these other states and a number cities, and then a number of states have done this as well. But a number of states have actually then implemented what they call preemption laws, where in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, through a ballot initiative that passed like by over 60%, a ballot initiative in Milwaukee to get paid sick days, and Governor Scott Walker's like, no, no, you city, you don't have the right to implement paid sick days. We're going to preempt you. And there's a number of other states that have done that, and that's been very frustrating, which also pushes for federal legislation. So I think there's a lot of pressure pushing towards the federal now, and a lot of energy building off the state excitement. So I hear you on this.
I hope so. I think she's enormously optimistic, but no, I hope so. I mean, I must say, during the 8 years of the Bush administration, in all seriousness, it was absolutely useless to push towards paid leave at the national level. So you may know this, that the Family Medical Leave Act, which is unpaid, was the first law signed by Clinton Gore, and it looked as if, I think when we all thought that Gore was going to be the next president, he was arguing that they were going to put wages in the Family Medical Leave Act, and that was a great moment of hope. Of course, that didn't happen, but all the activism shifted to the state level, and so I think, it's an important question, and actually historians are divided on whether state-level policymaking trickles up or crowds out at the federal level. So I hope you're right. I appreciate your the logic of your answer there.
This is the first, I mean, I've only been in Washington since 2000, but this is the first presidential election that we've ever seen where paid leave is actually a campaign issue, and it was a campaign issue on the Republican side until Rubio was forced out. I was so bummed when he was forced out because he was actually had a paid family leave plan. So, I mean, this is the first time it's been elevated to that level, and I think it's because both the urgency, but because of the excitement. So that's another.
I hope so. Let me ask you then about politics, a couple of more questions. Talk to us about social activism. This has also been a great political paradox in this country. A lot of political scientists have been very perplexed as to why American families have complained so little and have accepted this incredibly meager policy landscape. One of my concerns has been, of course, this is a cliche. I've written a couple of papers called "Why Aren't American Parents Screaming?" One of my concerns has always been, and this is, again, a very cliched observation, has been that activism in this area, you've pretty much hinted at this with the style pages, has fallen to women. What's causing that? What's causing consequence? How do we break out of that?
Yeah, so a number of years ago, we formed a group of activists and scholars thinking about work-life issues, and we did a couple of retreats, kind of planning like the agenda for what we wanted to see happen. And there are about 15 of us, and the coordinator had us go around the room and talk about how we got here. So it was one of these moments, you're kind of going around and you don't really, some of these things aren't really memorable when you do these kinds of little exercises, but this one was really remarkable because every single one of us, 201, I would say 2/3, came from a union family or were union organizers before doing work-life issues, and the other third either came from a family of social workers. And I thought that was really remarkable because this basket of issues, while important to unions, has not been at the forefront of what the union movement has been pushing in terms of policy. There's the Labor Project for Working Families, which has done great work, and they have supported these issues at the state level, but at the federal level, there hasn't been sort of the idea that this is the number one. I mean, I think so much of it's about the retrenchment, pushing back on New Deal policies, but that there has been this sort of push by a bunch of people who are like, we need to bring this into this activism, to this community. I think that one of the I mean, it's an ongoing frustration to me that it is primarily women when I work on these issues. It's actually one of my hopes that by writing a book about economics that I could convince some economists and some men who want to have a highly competitive, productive economy to see the full force of this. It's also my hope that by pointing out things like, the United States now has lower labor supply, both of men and women, than almost every other OECD country, and that's new. And scholars think that that is in no small part because we don't have these kinds of policies. That's a pretty disheartening statistic because you can't have a vibrant economy if you don't have people at work and if you're wasting all this talent. Another study that I cite, I feel like almost every talk I give, this study by Peter Klenow and 3 other authors, and he's at the business school at Stanford. They found that looking over the period from 1960 to 2008, that between 16 and 20% of U.S. economic growth was because of the opening up of professions to women and minorities. And that's just one study of a lot of studies that show that you want people in the labor force. We know that growth is caused by people getting out there. And so my hope is that by making that argument, you can get more men into it. But I will say that a lot of the women that I know that are in it because they see these profoundly as labor issues, not as women's issues. So that's my...
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody knows this. It's been a very, I think, a real drag on activism that so many of these issues got tagged as being women's issues, which obviously dooms them politically. And I noted in all these 20 million panels that we were on together, usually the audience would be 98% women. I had one very interesting experience, just to say this, that I was giving a talk in Washington many times about looking at models in other countries, and had been on a number of panels with Heidi Hartman, who's the president of the Institute for Women's Policy Research. And usually they were called work and family, or gender equality, or women at work, and how are we going to make this better? And we would go into these rooms over and over again full of women, which I always thought was really a big political problem. And I was invited to a panel that the Economic Policy Institute organized with Heidi. We gave the same talk, and they called the thing, it was in Washington, it was called The Problems of Low-Wage Earning Households. And I walked in, the room was full of men. And it was the same panel. It was just relabeled. So I think it was very, very interesting that I agree with you completely, but I think we've really cost ourselves. I frankly think this is my view. I actually don't know what you think about this. I've lost a few friends over this. I was very disheartened by organizations like Moms Rising and these political activist organizations using the language and imagery of maternity. I think it was really a problem, and I know others share that view, but I don't know if you do, actually.
I mean, I call it work-life, primarily for that reason. I want to focus on how this is about time. I mean, the labor movement was founded on the notion of taking people's time back, right? This is what this is about. It's about time. It's not just about women, and it's not... we can't make it about gender, even though, so women have changed how they spend their days, but it affects everybody. It affects men, children, the elderly, everyone. So I always talk about families or time and try not to make this into a gender issue, even though it disproportionately affects women, some of the negative repercussions and some of the policies. But I think actually what's encouraging is that wow, okay, so I'm going to say, so what's encouraging is that things are so bad that what you see now, and what a number of years ago, the Families and Work Institute, which is here in New York City, Ellen Golensky's shop, actually found that men are reporting more work-family conflict than are women. And that is a remarkable statistic. And I think some of it has to do with the elder issue that I mentioned earlier, that, if you're caring for an aging parent, if you're a guy, your wife isn't going to be able to do it because she's not going to be able to take off time for her, because she's got her own job and she's got her own parents. So men are increasingly taking leaves that are closer to parity to do elder care. So that's a remarkable, so we've made things so bad, right, that men are frustrated as well, and that's a good sign, I think, for social change. I have so many quotes in the book from men, and especially high-profile men. The Obama administration has been great at getting men out there and talking about it. Jason Furman, who's the current chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, just took 6 weeks of paternity leave. It was great, although I saw him at an event. He was not speaking, but he was at he was speaking actually at an event, and I was like, he's like, I've got all this time, I'm on paternity leave. I was like, that's awesome, but what are you doing here? But the fact that he did it, that the administration let him do it, and there have been a number of high-profile men who've talked about the challenges of addressing work-life conflict, I think is all a good sign, because we've made this a gender-neutral problem for families. But whether or not we can come to a gender-neutral solution, I think, is still out there. But fortunately, in America, we like gender-neutral solutions, and the policies that we implemented so far have all been, equally available to men and women. So,
thank you. Okay, let me push on. We're going to get to some questions fairly soon, but I want to ask you to talk a little bit about your take on, well, you've been saying this already a little bit, but let me reflect back to you something. I noted this in my review of the book, is that you're very generous. I think you can hear this in her. I'm now the kind of hard-bitten pessimist on the stage here, but you're very generous. In my reading, as I read your assessment, you blame underdeveloped institutions, public and private, both employers and public policy, on bad habits, timidity, the lack of sound thinking. I kept thinking while I was reading the book, she's way too kind, way too optimistic. Do you think that you may have, as Heather's often arguing, if only people knew more, if they thought in economic terms, if they had the data, if they looked at these nice policy models, it's very kind. So I kept thinking, is it possible that you've understated more nefarious forces like greed and misogyny? Maybe we have lousy policies and practices in this country because the people in charge are nasty and sexist.
Well, yes, that's probably true as well. But I think it's a fair assessment. I live and work in Washington and try to affect how we're thinking about policy, and it does seem like focusing on what we can do rather than what we can't is where my head goes. I struggled a lot. So when you write a book, people ask you, when you're thinking about you're trying to sell the book and you're trying to get somebody to publish it, there's a lot of questions about what the argument is and who's the bad guy, right? Who's the bad guy? And so I actually spent a lot of time thinking about who the bad guy was in my book. And what I actually came down on was that I thought the bad guy was people like Christine Quinn, who were working with a failed economic model, but pitching it as though it was just some nasty medicine that we have to take for the better of us all, right? That we can't do things that matter because that's just a job killer. So then the question is, if you think that this failed thinking, which you kind of correctly identified, either timidity or institutions, but it's also this failed economic model is your enemy. Whose fault is that? Is that nefarious sources? Well, in some cases, yes. And I talk a lot, for example, about one of my favorite examples from the book is this this restaurant owner in California who, when they were arguing about the family and medical leave bill in California, went on the record in the newspaper saying, well, if you implement this, I'm going to go out of business. There's just no way that I can sell hamburgers or whatever, and made these very sort of audacious statements. And then, of course, I looked him up. I looked up a bunch of these quotes, and in a lot of cases, but this one was really the quotes were the best. 7 years later, he sold his obviously successful restaurant to another small business owner who'd also been in business over the entire time period and was clearly expanding, right? So this sense that there are these people out there that are selling us a bill of goods and saying, well, we're just doing it because it's good for you. And they're tapping into people's fears, right? Because we are living in this period of massive income inequality, and Americans are being squeezed in this growing gap between productivity and family income. And we're told all the time, well, we just can't really do anything about it because if we did anything about it, it would even be worse. And so that's who I think the bad guy, it's not a person, but it's an ideology that's just wrong. And so what I was trying to do is give people who are trying to push back on that, quite frankly, an ideology, trying to give them some actual economic evidence so that people could push back against those individuals who may know better, or maybe they don't. I'm guessing that Christine Quinn, if we talk to her, she might understand that that's actually a failed economic model. So I hear you, but
I don't think Christine Quinn believed that argument. I think she wanted to be mayor, and she thought that Bloomberg would support her if she took that position. But if anybody knows better, you can correct me. I don't think she believed that for a minute.
We shouldn't have leaders that are selling us a bill of goods like that.
That's
true.
Yeah. And actually, if I could just add, Heather, the story about California is very telling. Our colleague Ruth Milkman, I don't think she's here, but here at the Graduate Center, wrote a book with Eileen Applebaum, who's a colleague of Heather's, they evaluated the California system, which was passed in 2002. And in fact, the point being that all employers were screaming that this was going to put them out of business. This is a paid leave program that's 100% employee financed, low paid and short, and they still thought the state was going to come to a crashing close. But years later, just like the evaluation of the Family and Medical Leave Act, employers were almost entirely positive about it. So I think Heather's point is exactly right there, that there's a sort of phobia about regulation. But in fact, something like 90 or 95% of employers in the first evaluation of the Family and Medical Leave Act said it had no negative effect on productivity or profits. and it seemed to raise morale and reduce turnover. So I think I do think she's absolutely correct that the shortage of information is really causing havoc in political circles. Let me just close with one last question. This is really more sort of speculative. As I've mentioned, I've done a lot of work on these same policies, studying them across the rich countries, and I'm often giving talks, and people usually often ask from the audience, what the hell is going on in the United States? Why, I put up all these graphs with childcare across countries, and then there's the U.S. with nothing, and paid family leave at the national level. The U.S. is literally falling off the charts, literally. Now, annual guaranteed paid days off, the U.S. has 0. Part-time parity, the U.S. has 0. So there's so many things that are just missing here. So why? What's going on here? So anybody who's taken sort of social studies 101 knows that it's a very long story that the U.S. Has weak social policy and small government. It's sort of referred to as American exceptionalism, not the kind of American exceptionalism that other people talk about. But in any case, when you get to work-family policy or work-life policy, we're exceptionally exceptional. We do have Social Security, we do have disability, we do have public education, we do actually have some social programs. Here, we are just unlike almost any other rich country. Why is that? What do you think are the sort of primary factors that are holding it back in the U.S.?
Yeah, so I think that one was that when we implemented the basket of policies in the 1930s that are still the foundation, we did so, just 12 years after women had gotten the vote. As I mentioned, they were spearheaded by Frances Perkins, who was the lone and first woman cabinet secretary of a brand new agency. She pushed the policies that she could. She knew that we needed all the things that we talk about here, for the most part, were things that, if you read the fantastic biography that Kirsten Downey did, she knew that these things were important. She herself was a working mom. But none of it really got in there. So I think one is that those laws laid out the institutions that we have and the ones that we've been living with and defending ever since. So I think that so one is there's a path dependency, and then two, as we've sort of looked to change things in the years since, what I hear a lot is that because that's what we have, that's what's fair, and that's what we should have. And I think it's been hard for people to kind of open their minds and say, okay, well, the Fair Labor Standards Act is really important, and overwork and the prohibition against child labor and the minimum wage are really important, but that's not the only legislation we need around hours. And I think there's both a fear of opening it up because what could happen, but then also a sense that no, these are our standards and everything else is just a frill, or it's not as fundamental. I think we've had a really hard time in policy circles coming to terms with that. And then I would layer on two other things. One is that, for better or for worse, the feminist movement in the United States and the activists that have focused on this basket of policies have been single-mindedly committed to gender equity. And so I think there have been moments where, had they said, no, it's okay, we're just going to have maternity leave, which is what most of Europe did, of course, right? Just leave for moms. If the community would have said, okay, that's fine, we don't need gender equity, we don't need it for dads, we don't need it for caregiving, that maybe that could have happened. But no, they fought for the Family and Medical Leave Act, which covers men and women to take equal amounts of leave for caregiving, for children, and for ailing family members. And I think that was really important. I wonder, though, whether or not, in a different world, because Europe, it was more sort of, there's a word for this, but more focused on the family, more focused on allowing women that time. And I think that's sort of the last point, is how that's really tied up in, and I talk about this a lot in the book, right? It's a time squeeze. And for a lot of families, that's, working isn't fun. And you're seeing this income squeeze, and women are in the labor market because they have to be. Maybe they want to be, but they also have to be. And it's very stressful. And I think there's a deep ambivalence in many parts of America about both the role of women in families, and also, because it's so stressful, there is this collective fantasy that women could just go home, that we can have that silent partner back, that if we could just get better on the economics, that we could have that back. So I think there's that, I think, is on sort of the conservative side. I think you see conservative voices not entering into this thing, which I see as so profound. It's about children and families and sick people. This is what could be more about family values? But I think there is this this ambivalence that's prevented people from seeing it in that way. So I think that's like, I guess, sort of 4 different issues.
I'll just add a few to those, and then we'll open it up for questions. Actually, I think the religious right, frankly, in this country has created a countervailing force because of the concern about intruding on families. That's been a big voice against institutional child care. I think also the inequality itself is a problem because we have such a high end, and what does it do? It enables families to exit the public grid. So you have private child care, you finance your own leaves, you can do almost anything, in which case, the sort of infrastructure really erodes. I think the mommy wars in this country are still more vitriolic than they are in most countries in Europe. And finally, my own answer to this question, I think that there's an obsession with long work hours, a pride about long work hours that's really, really deeply part of American political culture that is definitely missing in other countries. Just simply traveling and chatting with people, you'll realize that I often note this sort of stylized fact that if you meet somebody on a Monday morning or at a party in the U.S., and what did you do this weekend? Oh, I worked the whole weekend. Oh, my God, I was up in my office and I was so busy. My experience as someone, I do a lot of work in Europe, people don't say that. It would be viewed as highly unseemly to brag that you worked all weekend when you meet your colleagues on Monday morning. That's anecdotal, but I find it really widespread. And just to say this, that David Brooks wrote a piece in the New York Times some years ago, as I'm sure you all know who he is, a conservative columnist. The working hours data came out. Every year the ILO puts out working hours data, and it showed that Americans work the longest hours in the Western world. We used to be just below Japan, but now we've surpassed Japan. This is for those who are in the labor force. And I wrote a piece in Dissent that said, isn't this terrible? We're all overworked and falling apart. And he wrote, with the same numbers, aren't we proud to be Americans? Look how industrious we are. We work so hard, and as a result, GDP per capita is 40% higher than in Sweden, where they work, ironically, about 40% less, right? So progressives were sending me emails and saying, these kind of confidential emails. I read David Brooks, what's wrong with what he's saying? They said, I know there's something wrong with it, but I can't figure out what it is. I think the fact is the idea that long work hours are a problem, that time has value, hasn't penetrated even a lot of progressive communities in the U.S., and it hasn't helped. Anyway, that's my theory about or many theories, in addition to what Heather said. On that note, we have at least 15 minutes, maybe 20, so let's just turn it over to you all for questions. Somewhere there's a microphone. Jimmy, are you handing them out? And I think what I will do, actually, so I can see, maybe it's just for
His hands went up
over here.
fast.
I guess go ahead in the back there. And the white sweater, yep. There's a microphone coming.
Okay, great, thanks. So I had some red flags and some questions that went off throughout your talk. One of them was who pays? Like who pays for these ideas? Sound great, but is this going to be just another case of unfunded mandates? And there are questions about, I know you're pro-federal solutions, but what about state sovereignty and people's freedom? And when you were talking about approaching this issue as an economist, and that people were complaining that it would be a job killer. Well, I understand looking at it from a very global molar perspective and not, a molecular perspective, but as a practical matter, what do we do with that small business owner that goes out of business because they can't take another unfunded mandate? You walk down Main Street, and I go into a lot of, small towns and cities in Connecticut, and I see a lot of empty storefronts. I mean, what do we do about something like that? And with regards to David Brooks, he's like conservative light. I mean, I think a lot of people wouldn't even really consider him like a conservative. But I am interested in these things that I just mentioned. And I too was very disappointed to see Rubio leave the landscape because he did have this in his platform.
That's a great question. So first on the small business one, I mean, I think that what's kind of remarkable, I mean, so first to note that we've seen this economic decline in the absence of these policies. So just sort of from the starting point, it's hard to argue that that addressing this issue didn't cause the decline that we've seen. And I think you could actually make an argument that if we had addressed some of these issues, maybe things would have been a little bit better. I mean, that's, we don't know because we can't go back and relive the past, but we can say that this isn't, addressing these sorts of issues is not what caused the decline in main streets all across America, or, a lot of the income inequality that we've seen, or the stagnating male wages, or, the challenges. So I think that's sort of the first place to start. But I think your question about small businesses is so important because we want to see, small businesses are an important part of our economy. And I have, I think, like 3 or 4 answers. So first, in a lot of ways, small businesses are already dealing with a lot of these issues, but they're not dealing with it with a lot of support. So one of the things that we learned about the California and other states that have implemented these statewide insurance programs is that small businesses said, this is actually good for us, because most small businesses, and I actually now can say this because I run a small business, I have 22 employees, and I have employees that have, I haven't even done this for that long, and I've already had employees go out on maternity leave, and it's amazing how many people have family health problems. This is one of the things I've learned. And people need time off, right? And you can't, as a human, right, looking at somebody and saying, no, you need to, I know that you just had your baby, but you need to come into work tomorrow. We can't do anything about it. I'm not going to do that. And when you talk to small business owners, they already have to cope with the absence of people when they're sick, right? And so what the social insurance programs do in the states that have them is say, okay, you already have a problem, small business owner, so deal with that problem whatever way you were dealing it, but we, the state, finance through a tax on employees only, we're going to deal with the income problem that your employee has. And you know what it does? It makes it more likely that that employee is going to come back to you when they're done with their leave, which is what we've learned from these states. So that's a win-win for the small business. They already had a problem. You're solving a little bit of it by giving their employee income, and that employee is now statistically more likely to return to work for you, which means that you don't have to retrain somebody. So you haven't lost an employee who's presumably valuable. So, the other thing is that a lot of these policies are already being done in, many workplaces all around the country. Part of what I talk about in the book is that, as Janet mentioned, they're being done for workers at the top, but they're not being done for workers at the middle and the bottom. And a number of years ago, I worked with a colleague of mine to look at all the studies we could find on the cost of turnover. And what I wanted to know is, does it cost more to replace an employee at the top than at the bottom? And I wanted to know a number of things, but that was one question. And what we found looking across all these studies is that the cost of replacing an employee is about the same in terms of percentage of employees' salary for somebody at the bottom of the income distribution as it is all the way up to about $75,000 a year. So until you get to really specialized employees where, the cost to replace perhaps a particular kind of professor in a particular kind of field, that may be more expensive than replacing a line worker or a fast food worker or something. But the reality is that turnover is extremely expensive. All the policies I talk about in the book, the reason that firms do it on their own, number one reason, it reduces turnover. And one of the things that Eileen Applebaum talks a lot about, she does a lot of interviews with employers, and a lot of times, especially in larger businesses, the HR function is separate from the other, from other parts of the organization. So that cost of turnover isn't actually calculated into the cost of implementing the policy. Well, that makes no sense. And I'm on the Twitter feed of the Harvard Business Review, and I swear to God, I feel like every other day there's some HBR article that's talking about the productivity effects of policies like this that sort of acknowledge the time constraints of workers. And a lot of times they're aimed at professional workers, but I know from the literature that this goes up and down the income ladder. So I take your question very, very seriously. And what I can tell you is that there's a lot of economic evidence that this is good for, that yes, there are costs that a small business or any business has to face. They're facing it anyway. What you want to give them is more tools, and you also want to level the playing field. So it's not just you that might be giving workers your paid sick days. We know that firms that offer paid sick days, only people take 2 or 3 a year. So this is nothing. But if people don't come into work with the flu, they don't get everybody else sick, and so that's a productivity gain. So are these ways of thinking about it that kind of open up the broader sort of effects? It's a long answer, but
Let me just add 2 quick points, and that is that, as I think you know, this is really evident when you look at the European models, which I think are really very wise. There are carve-outs for small businesses in many cases. So for example, the right to request flexible hours in many countries, there are carve-outs for businesses of 5 and 10 and maybe 15. It is true that when businesses are very tiny, sometimes it's hard. But in the US, I think there's a sort of also kind of a political obsession with small business. The Family Medical Leave Act threshold is 50. That's way too high. There's no reason in the world to be having a carve-out at 50. The other thing I would just say is that advocates, I think it's true of Heather, and academics and advocates are very rarely supporting the unfunded mandate model. That's sort of an Americanism. So what does that mean? That means an unfunded mandate, you tell employers you must pay the leave of workers, you must pay. The European models are social insurance financed. The California model, as most of them are. The unfunded mandate is usually a very bad idea because it puts really bad, first of all, if you screw employers, that's not really gonna help in the politics, but also it creates incentives for employers to discriminate against workers they think are gonna use these leaves. So that's a real mistake, and I will just add, we were just looking, Heather was in my office, the San Francisco law that was just passed this week, which tops up the California social insurance leave, which pays 55% of wages. It tops it up to 100 with an employer mandate of that other 45. I applaud that they're trying it, but it is problematic. So that's not normally the way that we do it. That's what I would say. The European systems almost never work on the unfunded mandate. And I think that's a real misperception that adding leave means that employers are going to pay for their own workers. That's really almost never what we would be calling for. Other questions? We saw in the back. Cynthia?
Reaction to the notion of the ideologies of time. My studies of law firms show, where the billable hour is the way in which people are paid, and the more hours you work, the higher your salary or your take in the firm. And then I did a study with some of my colleagues here on part-time work in the law, both government work and private law firms, and we found that anybody who worked part-time, it was as if their IQ points had dropped precipitously, like 25 points. So they were, and especially for men, forget it for men, that the men in particular suffered terribly if they wanted to go on part-time, and almost therefore we could hardly find any people to interview. So how do you deal with these ideologies that are embedded in our social structure and our work environments that prize time? There are also, Jerry Jacobs did, Kathy Gerson have done work showing also the ideologies of time and productivity. So I think we have a different culture than the countries that you pose as models, and I wonder what your reaction is in terms of trying to make changes in terms of that overall ideology.
certainly. I mean, as Janet said, the United States has some of the longest work hours, and those are concentrated among some of the highest paid employees. And so this is particularly a professional worker, a professional family issue, which I talk a lot about in the book. I look at middle-class families, low-income families, and professional families separately because they're different challenges around time. And this is really the big one for professional families. And typically, you don't just have one person, you have two people putting in these long hours. And I'm glad that you mentioned that there are enormous part-time penalties, not just for women, but especially for men that choose part-time work. So yeah, I mean, so my response is that yes, this is an enormous cultural problem. You are seeing, I think there's indications that people are making, especially younger generations, are making different kinds of choices where they can. I would point to some recent research by Claudia Golden, who points out that women have been more likely to when they enter professions, to enter the kinds of jobs that give them a little bit more structure and less I don't know if the right word is individual responsibility, but they're more likely to, for example, if they're a doctor, to join an HMO or a hospital group than they are to do something on their own, because it allows them to share some of the burdens of the time commitment with their colleagues in a way that going out on their own doesn't do. Maybe they're sacrificing income, but they're getting some control over their time. So we're seeing a lot of that, but I do think that, the other thing we know is that as women have entered certain professions, the time quotient has gone up, right? So there's been, so that's been it's been a barrier that's tried to be sort of imposed. Like, how are you gonna, how do you prove that you're like this awesome professional worker when it's really hard to show your productivity as a professional worker? And it does seem that in America, we've decided to show this by FaceTime, by being in the office. So it's certainly a cultural hurdle, but you see everywhere frustrations with that. And I think it's incumbent upon us to be thinking about solutions, and I think workplace flexibility is one of them, but it's a bigger cultural conversation.
And let me just add to that to say that I think those of us who work in this field are often noting there are really three very different axes of change that we're interested in. One is policy change, one is changing employer behavior, and one is cultural change. You know, people quote, do gender. I know you know that. That's Cynthia Epstein has done a lot of work on these questions. People do gender, they do long work hours. So I work in the policy of that three-legged stool. My interest is mostly in the policy area. I think Heather's is as well. But I think, speaking for both of us, we're not really policy determinists. I mean, I think we think that policy is important. But these other things all have to happen at the same time. I think what's interesting, though, is institutions affect culture. And those affect employers. In other words, all of these affect each other. And there are many, many policies. So, for example, anti-discrimination, it takes a long time often, to see its effects. But let me just close with one example. There are some policies in this area that have almost instantaneous effects on people's behavior. And one of them, in fact, is paid leave for men that can't be transferred to their female partners. And there are lots of cases of this. In fact, in Iceland, we have a real Icelander here, by the way, in the front row. In Iceland, which has the most gender egalitarian leave law in the world, although in my view not gender egalitarian enough, but it has an unusual structure to American ears, not so unusual in Europe. This is what it has been for a long time. 3 months, this is for a heterosexual couple in this model, 3 months for her, 3 months for him, 3 months that they can share. When the leave that was given for him was no longer shareable, in other words, there used to be a shareable portion, men could take it, but then it switched so that it was basically, if they didn't take it, it was lost. The men's take-up rose from something like 17% to over 90% overnight. And that effect, now granted, of course, everybody's always saying, are they going to conferences, are they fishing, what are they doing? The research shows there's not too much of it. They think they're going to go fishing and play, and then they discover that children need to be cared for. And in fact, they're caring for the children. That's what most of the ethnographic research is showing. But so the point of all this is that there are some areas here where when the policies shift, people's behavior shifts instantly, and that has an instant effect on what's going on in the family. So I think there's a lot of interplay. Culture in Iceland has also driven the policy development, and employers react as well. So I think none of us think that culture doesn't matter. I think we think that policy helps to make those
I will
shifts.
note, I'm very proud that Maria Shriver did a blurb for my book here. I worked on a book with her a number of years ago where that's what we were working on was culture change, but thinking about these issues. So I think it's, there's a lot of people sort of trying to push this, but I would echo what you just said about family medical leave, that if it's paid, men think it's for them, and the only way to get gender equity in the workplace is for men to be taking that leave. Otherwise, his wife has to do it all, and she's got a job too. So you're seeing that, I think, in the states that have it as well, though that it's not as remarkable, but we should probably.
That's it, right, absolutely. I think we have time for 2 more questions. One there, right there.
Thank you. You've talked a lot about families, and I wonder if you can say anything about how the changes in conditions since the 70s affect people who live alone, who are responsible for all of their own income and all of their own housework, and if they want to have a support network outside of their coworkers, they have to go out and find it because it's not built into their home life. And then I'll also say my ANIC data shows that employers, because they can suck single people dry in that way, I'm wondering if that contributes to discrimination against people who have caregiving responsibilities.
Yeah, so my friend Rebecca Tracer just wrote a book called All the Single Ladies, which if you're interested in that issue, I would recommend. I have not had a chance to read it all yet, but I've heard her talk about it, and I'm sure, I'm like 99% positive it's amazing. But I'm glad that you brought it up because we are seeing this rise in singles, both at the young age but also at the older age, and people need just as much time off. It's why I called my book "The Economics of Work-Life Conflict" rather than work-family conflict. Sort of acknowledging that everybody needs time off, and that this shouldn't be policies that are just for people, especially the policies around scheduling. They shouldn't be just for people that have care responsibilities. Everyone should be able to take advantage of them. So I think it's an important framing that we see this not just about care, which is really important, but about control over time that allows us to do the things that we want to do with our life, which is why we're presumably getting a job so that you can actually have a life. So that would be my comment on that.
And also, of course, as you know, I'm sure you know, people who live alone often have care responsibilities
Yes.
for their friends and chosen kin and elderly parents. And so I think that's also something that people haven't realized until recently, that care is not just for children. Everybody knows that, but policymakers sometimes forget. Who has the last question? I guess right here.
I just wanted to know what you think politically has to happen. Even if we get a president who is for these policies, how can they get through? I mean, I think this is part of the ideology is people think it's an entitlement, and people don't like to vote for entitlements. And given the nature of Congress these days, what's going to happen there?
Yeah, so you would need so there are two things. One, as Janet actually mentioned, the first piece of legislation that President Bill Clinton signed into law was the Family Medical Leave Act. The first piece of legislation that President Barack Obama signed into law was the Lilly Ledbetter Paycheck Fairness Act. There's a theme there, which is that they were two pieces of legislation that were targeted at the base. I think that you're going to see a lot of pressure if you have a Democratic president to focus on this basket of policies and to do something fairly quickly, because if a Democrat is elected into the White House in 2016, it will in no small part be because of people voting for that person because they care about these issues. A friend of mine said a lot after the 2012 election that 1 out of every 3 people who voted for Barack Obama was a woman. So one out of every 3 voters was a woman who voted for Barack Obama. Sorry. So that's so women's votes really matter, and they've been mattering more and more for Democrats. So that's sort of one point. But obviously, this isn't going to happen just from the White House. It has to happen from Congress, and I think everything will depend on what the composition of the Congress looks like. There have been moments where there's been pressure on Republicans a number of years ago, not once but twice. The House passed legislation to give federal employees paid parental leave. The first time it passed, 50 Republicans voted for it. The second time, like 30 some odd. This was in the late 2000s, so the House has become the Republican caucus in the House has become more conservative. So there's been a decrease in that over time. But I do think the fact that Rubio and then, of course, Eric Cantor had also come out and talked about issues around workplace flexibility and work-life balance issues. So I think you're seeing more of an attention. I actually just did an event at the American Enterprise Institute, which is definitely a more conservative DC-based think tank. It was a panel with 4 of us, and one from AI. One was Douglas Holtz-Eakin, who had advised the McCain campaign, and when that was a campaign a number of years ago. And then Belle Sawhill and I, sort of representing more progressive views, and Senator. Oh my gosh, this is on tape, and this is embarrassing because I am blanking on the name. Woman, it will come to me in a moment. I'm just blanking on it because I know it's being taped and I know it's important.
We'll edit the tape.
Yeah, Republican. But talking about she gave the most eloquent speech I had heard. I was rapt about equal pay and the need for paid leave. And every single reason and message, and Senator Fisher. We were 100% in sync. Now, of course, the way that we would approach solving these problems differed, but the fact that we are in agreement that there is a problem and that we need to solve it and that this is the responsibility of the Senate this is an enormous sea change, I think, in terms of the potential to do something. So I remain optimistic in no small part because I've seen change over the length of period of time that I've been in Washington thinking about these issues. So I don't know. I think you might be able to get the Senate to do something. Now, maybe would it be exactly what I wanted? No, but progress is progress. But the House.
Well, one thing that should raise your optimism if we have a Democratic president is that Heather will be at the table. because she will be at the table. She is at the table. They listened to her in Washington. I don't know what the long-term result will be, but she's part of the conversation and has had a really big effect, not just on research, but also on the actual policy discussions in Washington. On that note, amen. Heather, thank you so much, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Janet. It's been really fun.